Hello, everyone. This is the 150th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Mr. Djamshid Foroughi and Dr. Mark Bowman as we discuss the November 1997 World Cup qualifying playoffs between Australia and Iran. Mr. Djamshid Foroughi is an Iranian author, interpreter, translator, and football historian. Dr. Mark Bowman is an Australian author. His book is The Yawning Giant, a sliding doors football tale. Well, welcome to both of you.
Very good to be here.
My
So,
pleasure as well.
Mr. Foroughi has been on the podcast a number of times. So, Dr. Bowman, can you please introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Well, I'm nothing more than a football fan. I don't think I ever got above Division 7 of a local football team. Most of my life, when I'm not at games or watching them, I was a medical specialist. I still am officially, but I'm retired these days, working in reproductive medicine and IVF. I followed the Australian football team on days off and really can plot my medical career and where I was with each World Cup cycle. That's the sort of guy I am. But I got into it because my father, who was first born Australian in the western suburbs of Sydney, unlike probably everybody around him who followed other codes of football, he was very much into soccer, as it often is called in Australia. He brought myself and my two younger brothers up to be rabid football fans. And from about 1970 onwards, we just embarked on this journey. Most of that time through to 2006, desperately trying to get Australia to the World Cup via the stands under very difficult circumstances. And we did eventually make that. So I have to thank my father in all respects for the legacy he gave me in being a fan of this wonderful game.
Can you discuss the status of Australian football domestically and international level as we get to 1997, bearing in mind their last World Cup appearance was in 1974?
I think the first thing you need to understand is that there are 4 football codes in Australia. And during most of the time in Australia's history, association football or soccer has ranked number 4 and has actually been actively marginalised, particularly by Australian rules football, which is very much promoted culturally as the sort of the Australian game, and to do anything else but to support Aussie rules would be considered treason. But nonetheless, soccer was actually the first code to have a proper national league, which actually folded in the early 2000s and then was reborn, a bit like what happened in America. But it was the teams and the league were very much built around various immigrant groups who migrated to Australia after the Second World War, particularly from Southern and Central Europe. So we had a Greek team in Melbourne and Greek team in Sydney and Croatian teams and Italian teams and Dutch teams as well. And that was a very, very healthy football space domestically, but it was very much marginalised because it was the migrants' game. So we had that going on at the National Soccer League level, and mirroring that in terms of difficulty was the fact that we were up until 2005 in the Oceania Football Confederation, which was the end of the earth to FIFA. And so we had this situation where in the early 70s, AFC and OFC played combination playoffs to get to the World Cup. And somewhere in the early 80s to mid 80s, that changed to having a full-blown OFC qualification phase. But because it wasn't deemed to be worthy enough for a direct qualification, we'd have this one-off do or die home and away playoff against another continental team. And that had been going on since 1986. And we had desperately fallen short under that process ever since the mid-80s. To summarise the situation in 1997 was that it had been 24 years since we got to a World Cup. That was a very much one-off, unbelievable effort in 73 to get to the 74 World Cup, amateurs, part-timers. But on the back of that, this National League was created. So we had a scenario where we had a very marginalised but modestly successful National Soccer League. We had a dearth of international competition where we play friendlies, often against clubs. Every 4 years, we'd play a few Pacific Island teams, New Zealand, and then suddenly come up against somebody terrible. So that was the background to where we were in 97, leading into what we thought would be a relatively easier task because we weren't facing a European or a South American opponent. We're actually going to now face the fourth best Asian team at the time.
Same question for you, Djamshid. In this case, Iran's last qualification had been in 1978.
First off, I'd like to commend Dr. Bowman or Mark. I love the way you were able to state so much in such little time. And I'm 100% with you on that because I follow all national teams, just about every national team on the planet. And as I mentioned earlier, when we had our own sidebar discussion prior to the program starting, always admired Australia as a sporting society. And that's why I probably know a lot of the players from the 60s and 70s. That might surprise you how many of the individuals I could name off the top of my head. But going back to Shahan's question, I became involved in football, I think, by osmosis. I grew up in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, from age 1 to 5. And the first photo I have of myself with a football is when I was 4. And it looks like I'm kicking it with my right foot. And I became very much dependent on that right foot. Oftentimes I've said my left foot was only for standing and my right foot was my preferred foot. But just like you, Mark, I played at the amateur level. I played 1 year in college in the United States. But at the amateur level, we had a very good team, but we were never going to enter any semi-professional, professional leagues. It was just a part-time venture. And like yourself, I've just been a lifelong football fan. I like to think of it as a virus that I contracted at some point at age 2, 3, or 4. And it's taken over my life ever since, for better or for worse. I grew up all over the world, but I spent 6 or 7 years on and off in Iran, and those were always the best years in terms of memories, in terms of experiences, and that's where really my love for football took root. Very critical points of time as well, and I was very fortunate to attend the very first World Cup qualifying match that Iran ever played in. It was in May 1973. And I want to say it might have been May 4th, but I may be off on the date. I was at the stadium. We played North Korea. My son now, who's 31, thinks, well, that must have been an easy match. But North Korea back then, as you would know, Mark, top teams in Asia, they were isolated, secluded, self-isolating, of course. But nevertheless, they had excellent, excellent teams. Some of our most memorable matches in Asia have involved North Korea. So looking back now, I was very fortunate to have been at that stadium. And it was because one of my favorite cousins decided to take me. And so ever since then, I tried to make every match that I could. And then, of course, we had the 1979 Islamic Revolution and everything changed, which leads me to 1997. Iran played its last pre-revolutionary match in September 1978. No more matches were played until March 1980 when we had the Olympic qualifiers for Moscow, which we, of course, boycotted eventually. So we qualified, we boycotted. 2 years went by without really any football. Domestically, the league had been canceled in the 7th week of the 78/79 season and didn't really resume as a league until many, many years later. In the 80s, basically, you had regional leagues that weren't very well structured. You're talking about dirt pitches, some shards of glass here and there, a couple of little rocks, believe it or not. And the stadiums were pretty much abandoned because the authorities felt that, first of all, we had obviously a long and ongoing terrible land war with the Iraqis for 8 years. So football took a back seat, sport took a back seat in general, even wrestling, which is probably by definition the closest sport we can name as the national sport in Iran. We had no achievements, very little participation in international wrestling tournaments during the 1980s. But as far as football is concerned, or soccer, We did participate in the Asian Games, in the Asian Cup, and Olympic qualifiers, but not in the World Cup. So we took a pass in '82. FIFA basically said that if we wanted to participate, we'd be playing in neutral grounds, but the country wasn't prepared. We're in the middle of a terrible war. By '86, the Federation, the Iranian Football Federation, decided, yes, we would participate, but FIFA insisted on playing on neutral territory, the home matches. The Iraqis actually agreed. We didn't. Iraq qualified. We didn't participate. So we missed out on the 82, 86 cycle. By 90, the lost generation, as I call them, of the 80s pretty much dissipated. And there was a new generation forming that, upon reflection, you can see started crystallizing in the mid 90s, just in time for 97, I would say, or at least the 98 campaign. It really started in the 92, 93 years, where we missed out on qualification to the USA World Cup. Sometimes I think maybe intentionally, because politically it would have been very hard for me to imagine Iran playing in the United States back then. I think things have changed to some extent with FIFA exerting so much more control. But by 97, we had just finished playing in a really, really competitive Asian Cup in 1996, where, in my opinion, we were by far the best side. We beat the Saudis 3-0 in the group stage, ended up playing them again in a semifinal, drew 0-0, scored 2 goals, both called offsides by Gandhi. If you recall, Gandhi was the Egyptian referee who refereed the South Korea-Spain match in 2002, later proven to have been corrupt. So, long story short, we were looking forward to the 98 qualifying campaign, thinking this might be our first chance after 20 years, similar to Australia. Although Australia, as you mentioned, Mark, was in 1974, so 94 would have been your, if I'm not mistaken, Australia faced Scotland in the 86 playoffs, Argentina in the 94 playoffs. I remember being in a bar supporting Australia, actually, for that tournament. I was. In any event, we were looking forward to the qualification. We had a very skillful team, but it wasn't a well-structured team. Facilities were beginning to develop again, but it was, for all practical purposes, amateur football. We had a couple of players playing in the Singapore League. We had nobody in Europe. But these are players who were flying under the radar, looking back now, because of the political and societal issues that the country was experiencing during the 80s and early 90s. And I think once the qualifying process started, we started really beginning to believe in the players. We were getting good results, exciting football, not very well organized or tactical, but again, very much dependent on individual skill and grit and determination and national pride and those kinds of factors. And then we started stumbling at the end, and we lost to Qatar in a terrible match. Less said about that, the better. And we ended up falling into the playoffs where we met Japan. It was a literally one-off, not a home and away. Lost in the 117th minute to a golden goal. After that match, we really felt that we were on the downslope, so to speak. And myself as a fan, I felt demoralized. I think the players felt demoralized. We had played in a very hot and humid Bangkok setting. The Japanese were fitter. I think they were more used to the weather, but they were also a better organized and coached team. And our big issue, I think, looking back, was probably having a coach or a manager who was really not up to par and had a lot of political ideologies that he would implement. For example, he dropped Ali Daei, who at that time was undroppable, for almost 7 months. In fact, the Iranian national team came to Canada for a friendly, and living in the Washington, D.C. area, or at the time in Washington, D.C., for me, it would have been a small, short trip to Toronto. I didn't go as a boycott to that decision of that manager. So things were beginning to fall apart. And then when we found out that we were facing Australia, which we knew, as you mentioned, Mark, Australia always would come out of the OFC zone, with the exception of 82, I guess. But in any event, with a lot of trepidation. And I knew the Australian players. Almost every one of them was playing in England, one in Germany, 2 or 3 homegrown, but homegrown players like Alex Tobin, who might as well have been playing in England, because he was one of those who always impressed me with his style of play, the calm and tough combination. So I wasn't very hopeful. And then next thing we know, we're playing Australia. And for us, it was a journey into the unexpected, into the unknown, because Iran ended up playing 21 qualifying matches. Back then, that was unheard of. Now you see some similar numbers depending on the confederation that's involved. But it was so long drawn out and so up and down, especially at the end, very much down, that we just basically put our hands up and said, we've come this far. We've shot ourselves in the foot several times. Let's see what happens. So that's kind of the mood. It was not so much anticipation, I think, as it was trepidation, but there's always some hope. And you go in there and, you
Because it's
clench your
football,
teeth.
right?
Yes, exactly. The ball
Yeah.
is round.
And Jamshid, to put things in perspective, to qualify, Iran had to play in a preliminary group with 4 teams, and that's where you have the epic 17-0 win over Maldives.
And Karim Bagheri's 6-goal record, which was broken by, don't tell me, Mark, Archie Thompson.
Correct. Well done.
13 goals.
Then there's another group, final group, where Iran
Yes.
finishes second to Saudi Arabia. So that's another 8 matches there. During this time, in this round, after the last match against Qatar, the manager, Mohamed Maili Kohan, he gets sacked and he's
Correct.
replaced by the Brazilian Vieira, who is the Olympics team coach.
Exactly.
Ahead of the playoffs, and there's the loss against Japan after extra time. They lost 3-2, and we come to the playoffs against Australia. Now, Mark, can you summarize Australia's qualification, which did not have as many matches?
Well, we had our usual sort of lopsided affair in the OFC playoffs, and we had a similar scoreline, I think, against Solomon Islands in one of those games, and then also Tahiti, which led us to facing our perennial opponents in OFC at the time, New Zealand, who have a similar sort of background of being the non-dominant sport in a rugby-playing country. So we had the traditional home and away against New Zealand, which we got through fairly easily. We supplemented that by playing a number of friendlies throughout 97. And from memory, I think we're undefeated. In fact, through the whole year up until the final games against Iran, and we're undefeated then too.
Mark, if I may,
Yeah.
16 matches, wins, 1 draw. 17
Yes.
consecutive matches, which was one of the reasons we were so much
Mm.
concerned, as I mentioned earlier. We
Yeah.
knew the Australia coming to play Iran in Tehran was not the normal Australia. This was the best Australian team, in our opinion,
Yes.
by
Yeah.
far.
And part of that background was that we had what was called the golden generation, which was primarily the firstborn offspring of the wave of European migration after the Second World War. And so they brought with them a football culture into a non-football society. And around those ethnic clubs, which had been so marginalised, raised their Australian-born kids. Skills that we have not been able to replicate in subsequent professionalism, interestingly. And that began, probably it was emerging in the mid-90s and really ultimately faded out just beyond 2010, what we call the golden generation, and really hit its straps not for another 8 years. But in fact, many people in Australia regard the 2006 World Cup team or squad as being exemplary, but the 98 team was, I would argue, also highly skilled, and they were young. They were Harry Kewell's first 2 proper internationals. I think he came on in a friendly or somewhere beforehand, and he was only 17 at the time. Created quite an impact in Iran and in Australia. Mark Viduka in particular, Ned Zelic, probably one of our greatest midfielders ever produced, Mark Bosnich in goals, and other fringe players we had. The flamboyant Aussie winger was one of our great strengths, so we had Stan Lazaridis, who was playing with West Ham, my English club team at the time, and Robbie Slater, who ended up with Blackburn, the winners' medal. He wasn't on the pitch when they won, but in the Premier League. These guys were all, and you mentioned a few others. We also had, in my view, and this is one of the things we'll talk about when we get to the game, a tremendous import in Milan Ivanovic, who come from the former Yugoslavia, played for Red Star Belgrade, but was not actually picked for those 2 games. He was on the bench, and that's a subject of much discussion amongst Australian fans of my vintage. Yeah.
Of course, the legendary English manager, Terry Venables.
Yeah, correct. So this was quite a coup at the time. Our federation was perennially a bit of a basket case, and probably half of the, if not more than half of the reason why football has struggled to progress through the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. I mean, one of the reasons we really, apart from the National Soccer League, we didn't capitalise on the 74 World Cup from an organisational perspective. It was run by a sort of what we call liberal in Australia, means more right-wing, a guy who lived in the wealthy part of Sydney called Sir Arthur George, who was the Federation president. He didn't get on very well with Raleigh Razic, the sort of the young, brash coach of the 74 team, politically quite opposite to Sir Arthur. The players weren't paid well. And then what led into the 77 qualification series meant that we were administratively poorly run, and that continued all the way through the 70s and the 80s. And we got a very sharp-talking president in a guy called David Hill, an English migrated fellow to Australia, and he was credited with the coup, as we call it, for getting Terry Venables. Literally 6 months or so after he'd led England in Euro 96, and he started as the manager in 97. And in many ways it was, and we'd had good managers before, but it was the fact that it was the sort of the genesis, and it took us 8 years to work it out after that. Management is not just coaching. It's actually getting your team organised, how you deal with them, but also how you deal with the challenges of things like travel and bookings and things. And this came to its fore with under was sitting 8 years later. But so, and the fact that, as you pointed out, DJ, that we gone undefeated, we were very, very upbeat about having Venables as the manager. We were all a bit cynical at first because he was going to be part-time and coaching an English team at the same time, and et cetera, not in the country. But in the end, the results on the ground proved it during those early friendlies earlier in the year and the qualification series itself.
What Mark just described towards the end especially reminded me of one fact. We were really downcast when Iran lost to Qatar, unexpectedly, based on, although this was actually a very good Qatar team. One of the problems with that is we knew we were going to face Japan in the playoff, but worse was that we knew that if we got past Japan, which was not going to be easy, and of course we weren't successful, then the real danger was Australia. Because of what Mark just mentioned, the way Venables set up the team, the way they played, the style, the results against top sides. I mean, you play 17 matches, you win 16 and draw one. We had no chance. I mean, on paper, we should have had no chance. And I know we're going to talk about this later. The fact that Iran progressed, I call it the miracle in Melbourne, but I'm sure I'm not. I think I was the first to coin it, to be honest with you. I wish I had copyrighted it because now everybody talks about it.
We have other names for it.
Yes, of course.
But it's interesting years later hearing the Iranian perspective about you were sort of very downcast because we never had that sense that that's what the Iranians were thinking. I think the average football or even the average sports fan who didn't know his or her football at the time, just because they read the name Iran, had assumed that it was going to be a shoo-in. The fans, the true fans, we had a sort of a quiet confidence, but we just had the trepidation that we always fall at this hurdle. But in the end, it was the former, if we're going to name one statesman of Australian football, it would be Johnny Warren, who was a former captain in 74, turned commentator, and then ultimately turned into diplomat and managed to bring the old into the new world in the early noughties in our game. Yeah, he pointed out from the start, because he had the experience, he said, we need to be careful of these guys. He named Karim and he named Ali Daei and Azizi and all these characters, and we had no vision of them, but he was calling that from the start.
And Mark, I'm so glad you brought this up, and we cannot divert from this discussion right this minute because there's something that follows up on what Mark just said. I've always considered every national side over the course of the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years can point to probably one icon that stands above the rest. And sometimes it might be two, you have Platini and Zidane in France, but for me, it was always Johnny Warren. Not just because of his playing career, but also all the other things that you mentioned. And I remember his commentary because I listened to it post-match, days after, actually. And the issue that I think should, if it doesn't still haunt Terry Venables, well, actually, forgot, he passed away.
He did.
He wasn't that old. He wasn't that old. And that's why I was thinking that he's still with us, was the fact that I think Venables by nature, always very confident, always very self-assured, his view, I think, might have bordered on arrogance. Whereas I think maybe Australian football was thinking, like, as you mentioned, Mark, very confident and deservedly so. But there was a little bit that I sense from Venables and from some of his press conferences, his comment about, well, we'd rather not go to Iran. It's not a safe place. Then they eventually go. We need to bring our own water. This is like as if Iran is just, a newly created nation that has no history, no past. I didn't ever get a sense. Venables, we knew, was a working class guy growing up. So I'm not expecting Terry Venables to know much about Persian history and Persian culture. But I know that the people in Australia, I knew those who knew their history and their football weren't arrogant or overconfident, but deservedly, you should be confident. And I think the players showed that they were confident. I still think Venables ended up biting himself with all the achievements, the 17 matches, the great football, the truly impressive team that he put together. Sometimes, you end up living by the sword and then dying by the sword in a very unfair, perhaps, way. But I think if he had been a little bit less, well, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
But I'm glad
You're
you brought it up, Mark.
you already mentioned Ali Dai, Karim Bagheri. Can you also name some of the players of this backbone of this new emerging Iran team?
I had already decided to name Doi Azizian Bagheri as the trident of death, Musallas Marg, as we would say in Farsi. And my friends and people that I would encounter picked up on that as well, because these were the three truly key players in the team. And then you add a fourth, almost like the fourth musketeer, or actually in this case, he would be the D'Artagnan because the other three would have been the musketeers. And that was the emerging 19-year-old Mehdi Matavikia, kind of our Harry Kuehl in a way, because as Mark indicated, Harry Kuehl was, I'd never heard of Harry Kuehl. I think he just joined Leeds, maybe that summer or maybe in mid-season. I'm not sure when. Mark will know better. And Mark Viduka, we knew, he'd been playing in Croatia. Then he joins Leeds. He's scoring fantastic goals. He's a classic center forward type. Very worried about players like him. And then, I'm not going to go through the entire Australian team, but every single one of them almost every single one was a well-known figure to fanatical fans like myself. But on our side, we had these three, and I knew that if we got to the World Cup, these three would have to perform. Matavikia was kind of the lightning bolt that showed up just prior and took the nation by storm. I think similarly to the way Harry Kuehl did. Matavikia got his start on the national team just a little bit earlier than Kuehl got his start at with the Australian national team. So I think Kuehl was a brighter comet in that sense because he just showed up like a flash. I think people who had followed Iran for the past year would have known that Matavikia was probably a big danger. But those were really the four players I'd like to mention. But we can't forget, and I know we're going to touch on this, especially for the return match or away match, depending on your perspective, in Melbourne. Ahmad Rezavadze, the Iranian goalkeeper, who was not only very talented and very athletic, but he was also ultra confident and a great leader on the pitch. And it was his aura of "don't worry about it, guys," even though we were being pummeled in Melbourne, that I think eventually spread to the rest of the players, or at least to most of the players. And he played a very important role in a non-footballing manner, as well as, making some excellent saves and, a one-handed catch where he could have used both hands just to kind of, send the message that I've got this, boys. Whereas myself, everyone else who was with me, and I'm sure the other 10 players were thinking, we have no chance. Not the way Australia is playing. But I think if there was one person on that pitch on the Iranian side who probably did actually feel that we had a chance was Abedzadeh. He was something else as a character, especially, and as a goalkeeper as well. Still, in my mind, the second best Iranian goalkeeper of all time.
This was not the first time that the two sides had faced each other en route to the World Cup. There was obviously the 1974 playoffs as well as the 1978 one. So in the 1974, Australia edged ahead In 1978, in the group phase, it was Iran who eliminated Australia. I imagine, despite this history, going into this particular one, the stakes were much, much different, and the press interest from each respective nation was much different going into this one.
Well, from Australia's perspective, in 73, it was part of this, well, it had been going on since 69, really, this sort of journey across multiple continents to qualify and going on the road for long periods of time when you had to quit your job to do it. But probably by 97, unfortunately, only the diehards will have remembered the 73 and 77 games. But I certainly do. Watching, and my father, of course, was heavily into particularly the 73 games, where it was 2-0 one way and 3-0 the other way. Those who were really schooled would have seen the atmosphere in 73 in Tehran to realise this was no mean feat. One of the, I think it was Ray Richards, he was allegedly hit by something coming from the crowd and went down like a sack of potatoes, as we would say in Australia. And later on, my father got to meet him and asked him, he's a lovely character, very funny guy, and said, "What was it that hit you?" And he said, "Oh, it was an empty cigarette packet."
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that, Mark.
They needed to hold out in that game, and they did. I'm sure DJ can flesh this out a lot more. But by 77, we were already in trouble because we'd lost to Kuwait. We won our Oceania thing, which was only 3 teams. We barely scraped by New Zealand to get into that next phase. We lost to Kuwait. Really, the air was out of our tank, I think, at that point. And then again, you're in Tehran. So I think that for someone like me was less of was already sort of, it almost in a sense, in retrospect, begins the decline, the 32-year decline and absence from World Cup football, that game in 77.
And it's strange that for us, for Iran, it was almost a different trajectory. 70s were the beginning of the formation of our golden generation. And we were just beginning to reach, I think, what would have been a peak in 1982, or by the time the 82 World Cup would have come around, when the country effectively imploded. So we have more pressing excuses that we can point to, but nonetheless, I'm convinced to this day, and I tell my son, I think if Iran had stayed on a progressive trajectory as a society, as a country, we would have been qualifying 82, 86, 99. We would have been like South Korea, 11 straight, 12 straight. I'm not sure if I think that they're on the path to the 12th straight qualification. But, oftentimes the economy, the politics, culture, all of those things play a role in how sport develops or falters, depending on the case. And so for us, the 74 World Cup cycle was our first. Strangely enough, we'd never entered the World Cup qualifying phase until 1974 or that particular campaign. And it was brand new territory. We didn't know what we were facing, but we weren't worried either because we didn't have that much competition in Asia at the time. Japan was relatively weak. They had some great players, but as a team, I think they were suffering from post-World War II infatuation with American-based sports. But other than South Korea and North Korea, an occasional Burmese team, sometimes Thailand, Cambodia even, and Israel. This is prior to Israel being kicked out of the Asian Football Confederation. I just saw a program from Israeli television interviewing 4 of the 1970 World Cup team who were also in the 1974 Asian Games final team who played Iran. And it was very interesting to see and hear their perspective on how things were. But in any event, it was much easier, we thought, to qualify. And once we qualified, we didn't know much about Australia. I didn't even know much about Australia in terms of football. We went to New Zealand, played a friendly match there, 0-0. Everything seems okay. Went to Australia and totally were dominated. In other words, Australia totally dominated Iran. And all of a sudden, we got a dose of reality. And not unsimilar, but again, in reverse order, when the return fixture was played in Tehran, we didn't really hold out much hope. But I had forgotten, and most of us had forgotten, we had one player back then. And I've spoken to some Aussies, Mark, in the last 10, 15, 20 years who were big fans just like you, even back then. And we've traded photographs and stories. And most of them always remember that one name, and that's Parviz Khalishkhani. He scored the two goals in the first half in the return match. And all of a sudden, the second half, we said, we can do it. We can do it. But as you indicated, I didn't know about that story about the empty cigarette pack, but Australia held out, and not through gamesmanship necessarily. I mean, that's part of it. I know Iran engaged in some gamesmanship in Melbourne in 1997.
The better way is to play that is to be in front.
Absolutely.
And to maintain possession. Then it doesn't happen.
Exactly.
Australia still fails to learn that lesson.
Well, but I admire the Australian side. And by the way, Sean, I think we should mention from an Iranian perspective, again, referring to Iranians who know their football, I've always felt that we would struggle, and this goes back to the 70s. I won't go back to the 60s because we really weren't exposed to international football to that extent. Almost all of our matches were against Turkey, Iraq, although Turkey is a European country, I understand, but from a neighboring standpoint, we played almost every single year against each other, and usually the Turks won. But Turkey, Iraq, Pakistan, once in a while, South Korea, North Korea, etc. But in the 70s, it was clear to me that the Iranian style of football, which is very technical, not very pacey, also physically very strong people in general, was not going to do well against, let's call it an English style of play. And we played Wales, I remember, in a prep match heading to the World Cup. We lost 1-0 in Tehran. We were out-muscled, which is unusual for Iranians because we hadn't played European sides who played like, say, Australia did. And so the 73 series, I think, showed us that you have to become physically stronger, not in terms of actual physique, but in terms of the footballing style of play. Tougher tackling, more running, more stamina, better headers, the things that Australians and well, as you mentioned, Mark, earlier, the Anglo-Saxon world and the Scandinavians do and the Germans do. Those were our weaknesses back then. By 77, I think we had really just formed this sense of confidence that I would equate to how Australia must have felt in 97. And we felt that we could pretty much beat everyone, and we did. And as soon as we reached that apex, it all tragically ended. And for many of those players who are still in their mid-20s, they never played again. And that's another sad part. They didn't go to other leagues. They decided, the war, the economy, the situation, losing family members. Hassan Roshan, who was one of our bright starlets, lost his younger brother on the first day of the war. He returned from the Asian Cup in 1980.
I remember that story.
Yes, yeah. And so other things just took precedence, unfortunately. And to this day, I still look back at that 77, 78 time as our peak, but we hadn't really even peaked. And so it's interesting how our trajectories in terms of Australia as a nation and Iran as a nation have gone in opposite directions.
Where were you each in life ahead of these matches, and how did you experience watching these matches?
As I was saying, in 1997, I was a young specialist. I'd finished what in America they'd say is residency or specialist training in the mid-1990s. Had begun as a mostly IVF specialist, working for a company in Sydney, which is now Australia-wide and international. We would have these retreats where we go away for weekends with the management. And so it just so happened, the game in Tehran, that I was in a small sort of resorty kind of conference type hotel just outside of Canberra. And I knew the game was on. It was on around midnight or something. And I'm, as usual, surrounded by nobody who knows anything about football. Maybe one guy was English, one of our senior scientists, but even he knew nothing about Australian football. And I said, guys, no, I'm going to go home to my room. I'm going to endure this on my own because you guys have no idea the stress that I'm going to be under and the enormity. It's already been a quarter of a century since we've been to a World Cup. I'm sick of going to these. Once every 4 years, you'd have this massive home and away and nothing much apart from a bit of against New Zealand. Yeah, I'm going home. I'm going to my room. And they insisted on coming with me and they played practical jokes on me. One of them put an egg in a bag in my bed and all this sort of stuff. And anyway, so they sat down on the end of the bed and I'm sitting there. As the teams walked out, Azadi is how I pronounce it, isn't it?
Correct. Yes.
110, 120,000. There's rumoured to be only one woman there. It was a bit like Life of Brian, and that was David Hill's partner at the time. But we're just like yelling the equivalent of death to our team. And I remember the senior accountancy guy in one of these rugby, North Shore of Sydney, which was the toffee part of town, just going, oh, when he just watched this and realised the enormity of it. And, of course, I'm punching the clouds when Kuehl scored, I think, in the 19th minute or something, and couldn't believe we got out of them. We were hoping for a win. I think we hit the bar, maybe the Iranians hit the bar. I can't remember. But look, to get away from there with a draw was fantastic. And if you want me to move to the second leg now, look, I was at the game. I was behind the goal with my father and two brothers.
Which goal?
The goal that Bosnich was defending in the second half. So the two Iranian goals have been right in front of us. That's where I was for those two games. And BJ, maybe you can tell us where you were.
We had an interesting situation because in 1997, in the nation's capital, and I'm referring to the United States, there was no place that you could watch Asian World Cup qualifying. And sometime, I think it was in late August, I went to a restaurant where I used to, and when I say a restaurant, the owner was a kind man, so I don't want to lambast his facility, but it was very much of not a hole in the wall so much, but not a place that you would necessarily take your family. It wasn't known for its meals. It was known for showing primarily European football. So if you wanted to watch Premier League or Bundesliga or La Liga, Serie A, especially back then, was very popular, obviously, and elite, you would go there. And his name was Joe. And one day I said, Joe, Asian final round qualifying is coming up, and you might want to consider purchasing the rights for those matches. And he looked at me and said, why would I do that? And I said, because for these Premier League matches, you get 30, 40, 50 people coming in on average. How about if I guarantee you 150 minimum for the first match, which is Iran-China or China-Iran in Beijing? And he said, no. I said, I guarantee you. He said, you charge $20 per person, and if you don't reach 150, I'll make up the difference. And he knew me well enough because I'd been going there regularly 2 or 3 times a week to watch the European leagues. So he said, okay. And he purchased it. And we had 200 with another 40 who couldn't be allowed in because of the fire codes. And so a tradition started. It lasted only 3 months, although it lasted for actually from then on in up to when this restaurant was torn down last year. And I sent Shahan a photo of it, actually. I was driving by Arlington, Virginia one day a few months ago, and I said, it looks like they're going to tear this place down because it was completely surrounded by construction tape and things of that sort. So I got out of my car, took a couple of photos just to remember exactly what we're talking about. And we started going to the matches regularly, and the peak was, the first match in Tehran. I think there were about 200 people who were left outside, who ended up straining their necks to watch through the glass. And by the time we had the Melbourne return, there were 480 people. Police, I heard later, this was 4 a.m. when the match ended, Eastern Standard Time. Police had come to the scene thinking that something unusual was happening and being told, no, we're just watching a match from the street, through the glass, into those little tiny TVs. And the police couldn't believe it. And so it was pretty much 99.9% Iranian fans. But for the return match in Melbourne, there were 4 Australians, 3 men and a young girl. And we'll talk about how they started reacting and how we felt. And then, of course, the tables turned at the end. But that's where we watched. I feel proud to have been the person who actually got the owner of the restaurant to believe in the fact that there was a huge interest among Iranians living in the area, and it just grew and grew and grew. But Mark, going to your point about the atmosphere at the Azadi, it's no longer that way. It's very sad. You might get 20,000 now. There are so many issues in our country now, and that passion, I'm sure, is still there, but it's not a priority anymore. And hopefully one day we'll go back to those days where there were people hanging from the rafters, literally from the floodlights. I remember once, actually, I think it was a 73 Iran-Australia return match where one person actually fell, fortunately not to their death, from the floodlight. So the actual formal capacity of Azadi in 1997 was 100,000. I don't know how they came up with that number because it's mostly concrete blocks, not seats. There are only about 300 seats for, VIP attendees. But I've heard reports of 128 to 130,000 for that particular match. So, when Azizi scored the equalizer, the noise, even just through the television, unbelievable. And yet, I was very surprised to see a similar atmosphere in Melbourne. I didn't think soccer, as you would say,
Well,
Mark.
neither did we, but we can talk about that when we get to it.
Of course.
Regarding the match, in fact, Iran had 4 players who ordinarily would have been suspended, but there was a FIFA ruling that said the suspensions were purged because it was a different stage of the competition. As a result, someone like Karim Bagheri was allowed to play in this match.
Not the first match, though,
Oh,
Shahan.
I'm
Not the
sorry. You're
first
right.
match.
You're right. My mistake. Yes, you're right. As far as Australia, they had to contend with some injuries. Paul Ocon was injured, among others.
Yes.
And the other important point about Australia is that they had not played a match for about 2 months. I think they had played Tunisia last. So they were not match fit as much as Iranians were.
I think that's right. And not all of this has been a regular problem, and it is for lots of nations now, is that you have these overseas stars, but they're not always in the first team. They warm benches, and I'm sure it's the same in Persian football, that this idea that isn't it better to be playing in a second or third division regularly rather than sitting on your backside on a bench.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But that's enough because the newspapers report such and such signs. And so that was the case, I believe, for Aurelia Vidmar, who was playing in Spain, the long-haired guy. It's not so long these days. he's coaching still here. But he was in La Liga, Spanish First Division, and wasn't playing regularly. So there were a few others a bit like that as well. So we had that uncertainty, but that was nothing new for us. I think the only other thing was that sometimes people retired and then came out of retirement. Mark Bosnich did that because it was just too hard to get back to play the Solomon Islands. And so I don't know whether that played much into team integration. But, Sean, we were well used to having long periods of, because we almost never played serious qualifiers. This was the problem. We'd play 4 every 4 years, 2 against New Zealand usually and 2 against somebody close to impossible.
I think that was one of the factors that Venables changed. As you mentioned, Mark, with the backing of the Federation, he was able to, first of all, Australia, I think, if I'm not mistaken, played in the FIFA Confederations Cup.
Yes.
Had some friendlies against top teams and beat most of them. They must have because they only had 1 tie, 1 draw.
Yeah.
And so the same problem, which now affects Iranian players who go overseas but end up sometimes in UAE or Qatar leagues because they get triple, quadruple the money and play regularly as opposed to going to some of the tougher leagues in Europe. I think back then, other than, as I mentioned, 2 or 3 players who played in Southeast Asian leagues, everybody was home-based. And I think that did help in terms of not only fitness, but more importantly, cohesiveness, understanding of each other. Even culturally, I've always been amazed how countries like Australia and New Zealand, 2 probably best examples, manage to keep players motivated to travel. I mean, just to travel from, say, Western Europe.
Yeah, these days and this began around the mid-noughties, is that our sports science is unparalleled when it comes to long-distance travel, management of time zone differences. And then, look, this became evident when we finally defeated Uruguay 8 years later.
I remember that.
We so carefully managed, with the help of our billionaire at that point, Chairman Frank Lowy, we chartered a flight from Montevideo to Sydney. And at the same time, Urs Hiddink had instructed the Federation to book every business class flight seat from South America to Auckland and then on to Sydney. So that many of the Uruguayans had to travel economy class, and we had this chartered flight with physios setting up massage tables on the flight, and they crossed paths in Auckland. It was clear the Uruguayans were completely shattered. So that's helped. Plus, particularly once we moved to Asia, there was a much greater incentive to represent Australia, because if you had any kind of Australian heritage and your other one was European, you had little chance of getting into whichever European nation into their squads. That's dissipated a little bit because of the 48 Team World Cup, but there's still a little bit of that. But in opposite, DJ, we had a lot of problems where people of former Yugoslavian descent would, despite having taxpayer-funded educations at the Australian Institute of Sport, actually went on to go back and represent their country of descent, which we regarded as great treachery. So it's okay when we inherit Scottish players, but it's not so good when they go and play some. Yeah.
Of course. Aussie Joe being an example, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember his last name. Croatian. Yes.
The guy that got 3 yellow cards,
Right, exactly.
I was at that game too. But
by an English referee.
Correct, yes. Yeah, whose reputation fell from that point. Anyway, there were 2 Australian-born people playing in the Croatian side that night, and 3 or 4 Croatian-descended Australians in the squad. That's a whole other story.
So, Mark, I was going to mention, though, when you mentioned the issue, it always amazed me that Harry Kewell played from 1996 to 2012 for Australia. Yeah. And I think might have amassed 50 caps.
Yeah. There was lots of times in the Oceania zone when you couldn't get them back, and their managers, this was before international breaks, they just wouldn't come back, and their English managers would engineer an injury or there'd be some reason. And so we had a B side team that effectively played against Tahiti and these countries, and then we'd get these stars. It began with Eddie Krenjovic, and it was one of the first ones that had the challenge of getting back in the late 80s. By the early noughties, when we moved to the AFC, before the international breaks, we had people like Tim Cahill just thumbing his nose at David Moyes, saying, "I'm going whether you like it or not." And so, but you had to be at a certain level, otherwise you were going to get punished by your club team. And so international breaks have sorted that out a little bit, but there's still a lot of travel down to our part of the world that both away teams and, of course, we have to indulge in all the time.
Makes sense.
The first leg on November 22nd in Tehran at Azadi Stadium. And per my sources, it's like 128,000.
That's the number I hear the most, Sean. Yes.
Yeah, ditto.
Iran started with the following lineup. The captain of the team, goalkeeper Ahmad Reza Abedzadeh, playing for Persepolis of Tehran, who at the time were called Piruzi of Tehran. We have Naim Sadavi, again, Persepolis, Mohammad Khakpur, Bahman Karaj, Mamad Ali Peiravani, again, a Persepolis, Mehdi Pashazadeh of Istiqlal in Tehran. He'd be replaced by Farhad Majidi, also of Istiqlal Tehran in the 75th minute. Mehdi Madavikia of Persepolis. Hamid Estili of Bahman Karaj. Ali Reza Mansourian of Istiqlal Tehran. He'd be replaced by Ibrahim Tahami of Istiqlal Ahvaz in the 64th minute. He may have been registered with Sanat Naft. That's something that needs to be verified. Also, Reza Shahrudi, who is playing at Altay in Turkey. Khodadad Azizi, who is playing at FC Köln in Germany. And Ali Dai, who is playing at Arminia Bielefeld in Germany. And the manager of the team is the Brazilian Valder Vieira. For Australia, we have Mark Bosnich of Aston Villa in goal. Alex Tobin, captain of the team from Adelaide City. Craig Moore from Rangers Glasgow in Scotland. Steve Horvat of Hajduk Split in Croatia. Tony Vidmar of Rangers Glasgow in Scotland. Ned Zelic of Munich 1860 in Germany. Robbie Slater of Southampton. He'd be replaced by Stan Lazaridis of West Ham United in the 58th minute. Aurelio Vidmar playing in Tenerife in Spain. He'd be replaced by Ernie Tape of Perth Glory. Craig Foster of Portsmouth in England. Harry Kewell of Leeds United, and he'd be replaced by Graham Arnold of Sanfrecce Hiroshima of Japan in the 89th minute, and Mark Viduka of Croatia Zagreb in Croatia, team managed by Terry Venables. In the 19th minute, Horvat takes a long free kick. Viduka received the ball in the middle with his back to the goal, and he passed it to the right side, and Kewell shot past Abedzadeh. Iran would tie the match in the 40th minute when Maravika's cross from the right side was knocked in by Azizi. That's the first leg, and it seemingly Australia have the advantage because of the away goals. Was there a feeling of optimism with this advantage ahead of the second leg?
Oh, look, all I remember is one of overwhelming exhaustion and relief by full time that we'd got away with it. I honestly, one of my problems is, and I'm getting older, I suppose, is I without watching highlights, I can't tell you details, except that you have reminded me of the Australian goal, which I'd have to say had all the hallmarks of an Australian goal. In other words, a crossing, because we didn't always have the skill to work our way through the midfield. The Duke always did his best work for his country with his back to goal, and Kewell just having that young brashness to back himself and take the shot. But look, yes, we had confidence. The confidence coming back built as we returned, because it was a confidence not only about what was going to happen on the field, but a confidence that this was finally Australian football's moment in the Australian sun, because we were so long the also Rans, and it was 24 years, and that nobody went to watch Australian football. It was marginalised, and here was the MCG being sold out with all sorts, which we can talk about, all sorts of things that happened around that game in the build-up to the match, that it was being covered live. I think it was a Saturday night from memory.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. And so the whole nation was watching, even the television, because SBS television, which stood for the special broadcasting service, but we also called it the soccer broadcasting service. It was a national funded fifth channel, second to the ABC, which is like the BBC. It was a secondary channel designed for, to use a better word, ethnic broadcasting. And it was in love with soccer forever, had out people like Johnny Warren on the commentary and discussion panels and all that sort of stuff. They were the keepers of the game. Most people couldn't even know how to tune in and watch, but people worked out that, so for SBS to create a ratings record of this game. So that was the sort of, as always, the true fans had their inner anxieties, as you always do. But it was the wider cultural confidence that I think was part of it that eventually exuded, particularly in that first half, on the pitch.
Iran had many opportunities, but had not been able to capitalize it in this match. So what was the takeaway in the Iranian camp regarding tactics to be used in the second leg?
Well, Sean, I think we first need to clarify what was going on in the Iranian camp. No one really knows. I can state from a fan perspective, when we went to this Summers restaurant and suffered through, as Mark mentioned he did as well, the entire match, we actually, and I'm speaking for myself, all of us felt that it's possible. And later that week, one night that week, I actually had a dream. And I'm not a believer in the supernatural. So I'm not saying that this dream was some kind of telepathic message or subliminal. I just happened to have a dream. And without going into details, because I can't recall the details even the next morning, all I remember thinking is we drew 2-2. And I think part of that is a result of my brain working overtime, realizing that that would be enough for us to move beyond Australia and go to the World Cup. And I didn't really feel that we were going to Australia and that we were going to win. I really didn't feel that. I think we played a really good match in Tehran. We did have 2 or 3 really good chances, and Mark was right. We did hit the post, but Australia defended really well and played a very typical Terry Venables match. Tactically astute, physically strong. For them, the result was definitely better. But for me personally, there was a spark of hope all of a sudden, and I started focusing on this 2-2, and I think that's why I had a dream. Sometimes if you think enough about something, it'll pop up in your dream. And that's what I think happened. And I remember calling some of my friends saying, guys, remember Saturday night, we're going to be there. We ended up actually getting there around 11 p.m. The match wasn't going to start until 1:30 a.m. Sunday. And I almost didn't make it in. If I didn't have the connections with the owner there, I think I would have been kept outside. So I was given a seat right in front of the best TV, despite getting there a little later than so many other people. And the Iranian camp, we have to talk about the fact that Badu Vieira, he was known as Badu Valdir, wasn't the Olympic coach. He wasn't necessarily someone that struck you as being very deep thinking, strategy based. He was more of a people's person. He was good with players. He was good with younger players, especially. He had a very calm approach to things. And I think that helped the Iranian team because typically we're easily rattled when there's a lot of pressure. We're the type of team that we end up playing to the level of our opponents. If we're playing weak teams, we don't necessarily do as well as we should. And when we're playing stronger teams, we usually rise to the occasion. But it requires a very calm, very logical environment, which is something, by the way, later that summer when Jalal Talabi took over, he infused the team with that, which is why I think Iran did so well at the World Cup. Hopefully, Mark not justified, but helped ease the wounds a little bit because at least the team that effectively eliminated Australia held its own in the World Cup. It's not as if, we went there and got thrashed, and that would have made, I think, Australians feel even worse about the situation because everyone in Australia would have said, had it been us. But in any event,
there was a lot of talk about had it been us, and
exactly. I can imagine.
In fact, it took. Look, we'll get to it later, but it took a long time to heal the wounds.
Oh, I can imagine.
That's why I wrote an entire alternative fiction work, which there's showing it again. The Yawning Giant is sort of a play on words because soccer in Australia has been called the sleeping giant of Australian sport. And so this was a netherworld that was neither here nor there, but the event that changes that game happens differently. Look, in the end, I remember I was at a conference in Sweden, and I recall being at a restaurant and I'd missed the game, but hundreds of Iranians walking down the street cheering and celebrating on the night you beat the US.
And that was, of course, a match with a lot of significance above and beyond football. But really, going back to Shahan's question, for me, there was a spark of hope. We knew we were going to get Karim Bagheri back. We missed him greatly in Tehran. Ali Reza Mansourian had taken his position, and as good a player as he was, I mean, he was a solid player. He was on the younger side still at the time. So he had energy, he had legs, he had good technique, but he was no Karim Bagheri. No one's ever been a Karim Bagheri as far as I'm concerned. Karim Bagheri is a freak of nature, for the lack of a better term. He retired from the national team at 26, scoring 50 goals in 81 matches as mostly a defender or defensive midfielder. And he just played with so much joy and determination and belief. As a character, as a person, he is by far, I would say he's one of the two most popular players to have ever played in Iran, or at least post-revolution, let's call it, because of all of these characteristics. So we knew Bagheri's coming back. We knew we would need him desperately. And I kept thinking 2-2, that's all we need, 2-2. 1-1's not going to do it because we go into extra time, we're not going to make it. So if we can avoid losing and somehow miraculously score 2 goals, which was going to be very difficult given the way we weren't able to score on some of the chances we had in Tehran, then that's all we needed. So I just kept thinking all week, just 2-2, please give me a 2-2. And of course, as you know, Mark, up to the 74th minute or so, I didn't see one coming, let alone 2.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Yeah.
So, going back, Sean, in the camp, I don't think the Iranian camp had any particular. One thing I can tell you, I knew right away that Australia would go back and Venables would go back with the staff and say, the right back in the Iranian team is weak. And let's do something to take advantage of that. And I think that's why Stan Lazaridis showed up and started the match in Australia. And he just He
Oh,
just killed it.
down our left wing, that first half
Exactly.
was
Exactly.
ridiculous. It was
Yeah. And
ridiculous.
we didn't have, honestly, Sean, I don't think Vieira and his team had the same, anywhere near the same capability to discern and analyze and adapt and adopt and prepare as the Australian staff did. We were miles apart in terms of level of professionalism and quality of coaching and managing and tacticians and things of that sort. So I think we were basically winging it, for lack of a better term, on the strength of some very, 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 very good players who really weren't appreciated or recognized outside of Iran. And when you mentioned, Shahan, that Dai played for Arminia Bielefeld and Zizi was playing for Cologne, they had just moved there 2 or 3 months, 2.5 months prior to this match. So they were new to the European football as well. So it's not like they had the same experience as most of the Aussies had, which gives you confidence. And so again, I go back to my trident of death plus Matt Deviki, the four Musketeers. That's what we really needed to rely on, and Abedzadeh in goal.
The return leg the following week on November 29th was at Melbourne's Cricket Ground. Now, prior to this match, many of the 1974 World Cup players were paraded around the ground before the match. That probably showed a certain sense of confidence for qualification.
Well, as I said, it was actually this was the Socceroos stepping into the sun properly. We were going to heal the wrongs of 24 years. But the day began well before that. I mean, I'm in Sydney, so we all flew to Melbourne, the family, my brothers and father and I, and met up with the faithful. We pre-booked our tickets we were a bit young and not so much my old man, but we were in it wasn't really the ultra area, but the flare that went off was right next to my father. It melted my father's seat. We hastily had to find him another one. So that's where we were, DJ. If you look at if you've got ever see the image of that. But we spend the day, as is traditionally in Australia. We arrived. There's any number of small to medium-sized hotels, pubs based around the MCG. So we had been enjoying ourselves in the sun for all afternoon before heading to the ground. Some of the cultural things, of course, you understand, it was the Melbourne Cricket Ground, and that's simply because, well, two factors. One is that we don't have purpose-built football stadiums of that size. We certainly didn't then. Even today, most of our large stadiums where we play our internationals are multi-purpose, so we play other versions of rectangular. And sadly, even to this day, there are only 2 or 3 decent, proper football stadia south and west of what we call the Murray River, the river between New South Wales and Victoria, because everything is so AFL, Australian rules football, dominated down there. And by the way, to this day, many of us regard the MCG as the wrong place to play a football game, partly because of the history, but partly because it's almost circular. So we had a better view behind the goal than you would have from the sidelines. Mm. But anyway, we dealt with all of that. Billboard advertisements for Mark Bosnich as you came from the airport with Aussie rules soccer, as the saying, because the Victorians don't understand the word football at all. Anyway, from that part of the world. So we arrived at the stadium, and yes, it was very emotional watching the 74 team being paraded around on vintage cars because, as I said to you earlier, the Federation does a terrible job of administration. To this day, their history, their embodiment of the history and treatment of former players is not great. It's better today, but it's nowhere near what it should be. Important pieces of memorabilia are gone disappearing. A famous Australian FA Cup style trophy was, up until 5 years ago, was used as a hat stand in the Federation's offices. This sort of stuff. These marketing kids have no concept of this. But it was even worse. So to see them, with one exception, by the way, which probably DJ knows about, because I've now discovered he knows everything about international football. The one person who wasn't there was the 74 captain, Peter Wilson, who became a recluse and has never spoken to the press or anybody, apart from one friend I have in Germany who, for some reason, has made a connection with him, has led a completely private life ever since quitting the game in the late 70s, which is very sad because he's the equal most capped captain for Australia in A international, along with Lucas Neal. Well, in fact, the argument is that maybe he's one better, but there's even that can't be because our history is so terrible.
I didn't know that, but this brings me to a name that I want to mention, and I'm not sure if you would have mentioned him, but I'm just going to play it safe. Ray Bartz.
Yes, yeah.
I always felt so bad for Ray Bartz. Yes. Yeah. Was he there?
He was there. Yeah, he was there. They're effectively all there except for Wilson.
I'm so happy to hear that he was there. I'm happy that he was there.
Yeah. No, Ray Bartz, and he's still gets around in Newcastle, ran a sports store for years. Typical, you know. And if you didn't know, Sean, he was an integral part of our qualification process for '74. And in a friendly against Uruguay in Sydney, one of the Uruguayans gave him a karate chop to the neck, and he got some neurological symptoms and had to pull out. He travelled with the squad to '74.
Which was such a nice move by Rail Razic, yeah.
That's classic Rally Razic. Yeah. Rest in peace.
Rest in peace.
So anyway, that was the game. And of course, at kickoff, or just before kickoff, Australian crowds are not noisy. To this day, we still will get out chanted by the small away section. It happened only 2 weeks ago in Melbourne against Saudi Arabia. We were out cheered by Saudi Arabian fans, and there were 27.
Oh my.
It's just terrible. We have no organised chanting. In fact, if you want to be in the active area behind the goal in Australia, it says on the ticket, you are buying a ticket into an active area, you know, standing and everything happens. But people who buy last-minute tickets, they then complain about the flags waving in front of them and that people are standing in front of them. And so what happened is that they played the national anthem, and I think it was the loudest singing of that anthem I've ever heard. So I get very emotional about this to this day. Yeah. And so that really set the scene for the game. And it wasn't so much English style singing and chanting, but it was just then the volume of noise that just kept going. And that was made more by what was happening on the pitch. The noise never settled for long periods of time. But I think it was the anthem. And by the way, just sorry as an aside about our national anthem, which grew out of the left-wing government, Labor government at the time in the early 70s, because God Save the Queen was our national anthem, same as England's. And the very first national team that had the national anthem, the new national anthem of Advanced Australia Fair Play, was at a football match at the Socceroos game in the early 70s. Wow. And the Prime Minister was there, and he was good friends with Rally Razic at the time. So the rugby guys, who were all the upper-class private school educated, they had nothing to do with it for a long time. So that was yet another. And, of course, in Melbourne, AFL, they don't have internationals, so they don't understand the meaning of singing a national anthem at the start like that. Yeah, so that was created, all of this created the most electric atmosphere.
Everything that Mark just indicated, from parading the former greats to the national anthem to the atmosphere, came through loud and clear the television sets that we were watching, even though we were literally a world away and we were crammed into this small space. It was impressive and therefore frightening. No question, I think that affected our players. I don't think they would have been expecting that. I know I wasn't expecting that. We were used to the calm, quiet Aussies, at least in terms of this sport that Mark has referred to before. I remember the 77 match in Australia that Iran won with a late Hassan Roshan goal. It was Sydney. It was a small pitch. It was almost like a fourth division English.
Was it the Sydney Sports Ground? It might have been.
I think so. Yes, I think so. Yeah. It was quaint, and I loved it. I mean, I thought it was really interesting, but it spoke to the lack of importance or the low priority the sport enjoyed, for lack of a better term, at the time. So yes, this was just almost like we were going into the Lions in the Coliseum. That's how I felt. You always have hope, but that start really didn't help. And everything from my perspective, just this is just Djamshid Foroughi speaking. Everything pointed to an Australia qualification, from the Terry Venables appointment to the results that the team had achieved, the momentum, the stars that were emerging. and then all of the issues that we as a society had been experiencing for almost 2 decades. And it just somehow gave me the sense that prepare yourself for the worst, hope for the best, and the rest is history.
This match was in front of more than 85,000 fans. As far as the lineup, not many changes. For Australia, you have Bosnich, Tobin as the captain of the team, Craig Moore, he replaced by Graham Arnold in the 78th minute, Horvat, Zelic, Lazaridis starting, Robbie Slater, he'd be replaced by Tony Vidmar in the 76th minute, Aurelio Vidmar, he'd be replaced by Ernie Tape in the 76th minute, Craig Foster, Kuhl, and Viduka. For Iran, you have Abedzadeh as the captain of the team. Sadavi, he'd be replaced by Ibrahim Tahami in the 70th minute, who 14 minutes later would be replaced by Ali Akbar Ostad Asadi from Zobahan of Esfahan. Khakpur, Peiravani, Pashazadeh, Estili, Karim Baghari back in the side from Arminia Bielefeld in Germany. Mahdavikia, Shahrudi, he replaced by Alireza Mansourian in the 52nd minute. Azizi and Ali Dai. Australia would take the lead in the 32nd minute. Aurelio Vidmar crossed from the left side, and Harry Kuhl just knocked it in at the far post.
Mm-hmm.
We come early in the second half, in the 48th minute. Lazaridis' cross from the left side was headed by Kuhl at the far post into the box. Foster headed it to the post, and Vidmar knocked in the loose ball. So everything is going seemingly as planned for Australia. Now we come to the much talked about event in this match, where a fan enters the field.
I wouldn't use that word, but
Well,
keep going.
I knew you were going to say that, Mark. I knew you were going to say that.
so
Well put. Well put.
this individual runs to the field and starts cutting a part of the Iranian side of the net. And of course, the police quickly apprehend him. But as a result, many feel this may have broken the momentum of Australians during this chaos.
In this particular instance, not having been in the stadium, my perspective is going to be less valuable, but I want you to know of it, and know how we felt, and maybe merge that into your explanation. Because when that happened, we had already given up. And all it did is it gave us about 10 minutes to look at each other with downcast eyes and just try to find a way to slink out of there. But again, you can't do that, of course. If you're a real football fan, you stay to the last. I've always told my son, you stay to the last, you arrive
Correct.
well before kickoff, and you stay well after the match ends. And we had no sense that this was going to either turn the tide or change the momentum. But upon reflection, I felt, and this is where, of course, I think it's more important to hear your side and your experience. I felt Australia might have had the time to say, you know what? We're well in control. They've had one shot on goal. It's 2-0. And I've played, as you have as well, at lower levels. And there have been times where an injury has held up play for 10, 15 minutes. It does change something. But I would not go as far as saying,
Yeah. And probably, Sean, I mean, you just to reflect, you summarised the two goals. You didn't really summarise the state of the one-sidedness, particularly in the first half, where there must have been half a dozen chances that we variously blew. And I remember my friend's younger son, Tuolong, saying, "Oh, look, it's not good if we keep missing all these chances." And his father roundly scolded him, and of course he was right. It was incredibly one-sided, but this inability,
so.
And maybe that reflects people like Aurelio Vidmar's lack of first team game time leading into that, because he missed a couple of them. Viduka, I think, missed one as well before finally Kuhl scored. And, of course, the second half began in the same way. So first of all, to paint the scene, I mean, this guy was actually well known. Our most famous horse race, the Melbourne Cup, it's the first Tuesday in November, the same day as Election Day in the US, but every year. He'd run onto the track only 3 weeks before. He'd also been at the Australian Open tennis. He's unfortunately a schizophrenic guy, and he's still alive, but has spent time in and out of institutions. And Peter Hoare is his name.
Yes.
So we sort of missed it all in the excitement, because I don't remember at all him. There was the other side of the field, the other end of the field. We're all celebrating the goal, mentally booking our flights to France and all this sort of stuff. And the next thing we know, the net's down, and we're trying to work out what's going on at the other end. It took variously, we think, about 8 minutes to get the game back underway.
It felt longer.
It did feel longer, but I think in the end, when I've watched the replay...
Yes. No, you're right. You're right. Yes.
Put the clock on, it's about that. It felt a long, long time, and we thought, this is another example of Australian football returning to its amateurism that we can't even... Anyway. And look, in popular culture, amongst fans to this day, but also amongst the wider community who remember, sadly, lots of people weren't born then, that's not sad, but they weren't around then or are new to the game. But in popular culture, it was all about that moment. It had nothing to do with tactics, nothing to do with any other mindset. In contrast, there were many football tacticians who say that it was actually... Because, in fact, when the game resumed, if you watch it for another 10 or 15 minutes, Australia was doing exactly the same thing, all over them and missing chances.
Yes.
It wasn't until it turned around at the end. And everybody says, well, Venables should have brought Ivanovic on. Mind you, Ivanovic hadn't played in the other game, and but Australia had never lost when he was on the field. That was the statistic that people think about in retrospect. So I think there were some tactical or managerial, if you like, or psychological blunders made by the team. But I still think there was a significant element of that stoppage that did something. I think you're right. I would agree with you. But yes, I'm not of the camp that it was 100%. In my book, which I wrote, an Aussie rules-loving security guard tackles him before he gets to the net, and that changes the whole course of Australian football's history, which I just had to do because I had to get that off my chest about it. And so it probably looks to any casual reader of that I'm of that school, that it was all about Peter Hoare, but it wasn't. It was just the most bizarre thing on a bizarre night when all these other things were happening. That out of the blue, this happens as well. Yeah, so that's my take on it.
Your term bizarre, I think, sits very well with me. I hadn't really thought of that night and that match as a bizarre night. Of course, I have a different perspective, but putting myself in your shoes, and I'm really capable of doing that generally. I'm a very empathetic person, but as fellow football brethren, we can always feel each other's pain and each other's joy. If I were Australian, I would refer to that night as bizarre. There's no other way to explain it. It's just bizarre. It is. You're right. It's not a miracle to that. I mean, to me, it's a miracle because that has a more of a positive connotation. But it was a bizarre night. I have never experienced it since or before.
You can liken it to the November 17, 1993, the France-Bulgaria match with that last-minute goal.
No, please, no. My hero, Eric Cantona. Oh, no. You're making things worse now, I think. I'm not sure where Mark stands, but I didn't need to be reminded of that one.
Look, nothing rates with 97 that Iran game to Australians. Nothing.
No.
It's just up there. It's getting back to culture. What's our true national day of the year? It's actually Anzac Day, which commemorates the landing of Australian and New Zealand forces at Gallipoli in the First World War, which had all the elements of classic Australian. It was a decision by Winston Churchill. It was all his fault. The bombs landed us at the wrong place, and the English, and it was a disaster. And so our national day is a celebration of a terrible day. So that was Australian soccer's Gallipoli that night. It didn't feel like after that we still felt, but as the game, and of course we kept pressing high, and that's what led Well, the first goal was actually, no, that's right. The first goal was actually one that could have been offside. People only 2 days ago on Twitter were drawing lines across where the defender was as he was on his backside pushing the ball back or something.
Yes. So
Mark, to be honest with you, that very moment, even though I was still focused on the match, but half of my mind was not really there anymore. I can't remember ever having lost faith before the 90th minute, but I think that night I experienced that. So I was focused, but not as laser focused as I usually am. I don't drink when I'm watching a football match. I don't want to have anyone around me. No one can talk. If they are around me, they need to go upstairs or downstairs or somewhere far away. It doesn't matter what match it is. I just have to be fully focused. At that very moment when Azizi scooped the ball out from between the two Australian defenders, I thought, I think this is offside. And I think it was just such a hectic scene that obviously there was no VAR, perhaps
Yeah.
fortunately. But I agree. I can see where a question mark could have been raised and probably was raised, in the minds of the officiating crew and the players on both sides. But you play on, so.
Yes. No. And again, there are other Australian fans who will complain about both goals being offside, or that's the talk of people who don't know really.
Right. The second one
who
was
are not aficionados. They might be fans, but yeah.
Exactly.
The game was what it was. We shouldn't have placed ourselves in those positions.
Exactly. Exactly. Mark, and I apologize, Sean, but this might be of interest. The 2015 Asian Cup was held in Australia. In that tournament, Iran and Iraq played. By far, Iran was a superior side and played far better. And we ended up with a red card, which was harsh. My son to this day can't get over it. And I say, if our player hadn't given the official the opportunity, the excuse to even consider a red card, we wouldn't be talking about this. We would have won the match 3-0, maybe 3-1. But when you make a mistake, a silly mistake, that could be a red card offense or not, then you put yourself in that position. So I respect what you've just said about that.
It was 3-3 in the end, wasn't it? Was it and penalties?
Yes, 3-3 after extra time, penalties. I went to bed before the penalties started. My son says, "Where are you going?" I said, "I will never, ever watch Iran take penalties because we always lose." And sure enough, we lost.
So you broke a rule about watching to the end of the game.
Yes, but the match is officially, Mark, the match is officially considered over. Right?
Fair enough.
But good point. Good catch.
The Iran goal was in the 75th minute, near the end, so quarter an hour left. Like you said, there was a scramble in the box, and somehow Azizi on the right side just crossed across for Bagheri to score.
He was actually on the ground. The ball was stuck between the legs of two Australian defenders. I want to say Robbie Slater was one. Not that he's technically a defender, but I think he was defending at that moment. And it hit the back of one of those two defenders' heel. And so it fell invitingly for someone like Azizi, who is a bit of a combustible character, but very sharp footballing brain. And I think many other players would not have just jumped up and quickly poked it into the 6-yard box. I think if it had been, for example, Ibrahim Tahimi, there's no chance that would have been a goal. If it had been many of the other players, it wouldn't have been. But Azizi is known for that, actually, for being a step ahead in terms of his mental acuity and his skill, of course, too. So it was a fortuitous goal, no question about it. And actually, before Karim Bagheri scored, it may have fallen in front of Estili, and he may not have scored. Who knows? So I'm glad that Karim decided not to give Estili a chance and put it away. But the second goal, I think, had all the hallmarks of just a classic, beautiful counterattack goal that, as you mentioned, Mark, should have never come to that. It should have been 3-4, 5-0, perhaps. Yeah, you would have won 5-2, 4-2.
Yeah, but as you know, there's a famous saying in football that the hardest lead to defend is 2-0.
Yes.
And at 2-1, certainly where I was, because I'm surrounded by the faithful 24 years, we'd experienced all this exhilaration. Suddenly at 2-1, the air goes out of the place, or certainly goes out of where we are, because you realise you've blown these chances. It's now suddenly 2-1, and it's suddenly on a knife edge. Because when we went 2-0 up, the first thing one of my brothers said to me, well, it's certainly not going to extra time now, because we either go through or
Yes.
we either win or if it's a
Yes.
draw.
Yes. You're right. Yes.
And so the second goal almost had this sort of air of inevitability about it.
Really?
Really? Well, in a sense, it's just that because by this stage you've subbed off the people that
Yes.
you've got your second guys on. Not that, I mean, Graham Arnold was, I'm to this day, he's the greatest servant of Australian football ever, at international level.
Yes,
That was
sure.
his final international game. And of course, he's just stepped down as the manager of Australia, having been the most successful Australian coach at a World Cup ever. Not so much inevitability, but just incredible anxiety. The confidence is suddenly gone. And the very people that Johnny Warren had told us about on television 2 nights before, or that beware Iran, they're a good team, they're intelligent, they have some fabulous players, they play in Europe, even if they'd only just started there. But, and once that happened, we just knew we couldn't get a third. You just knew that, and that's where I think your keeper, as you said, really came to the fore. He did early in the game as well. But, it's at that point that every half-baked chance just looks pathetic in those last few minutes when you're looking for a third. And what'd you do that for? Somewhere in there, one of the Iranian defenders had both of his arms round Viduka in the box.
Yes,
so people
yes.
pointed to that, whether that should have been a penalty. But
Yes.
look, the reality is we had once again put ourselves into a difficult situation where you have to win your qualifiers at home. And here we were again, 24 years on, with minutes to go. My brother, same one, yelled at me, we're never going to qualify,
Well, and it's interesting that you've brought up your perspective, having been there, because we didn't sense that several thousand miles away watching via television. We didn't sense that. Perhaps we were. And even though Azizi tied the match, we were by no means jumping up. Well, of course, we were jumping up and down at the moment he scored, but we immediately got hold of ourselves and said, there's 10 minutes plus who knows how much at a time, because I really thought that it felt like 20, 25 minutes, that whole Peter Hoare incident, for lack of a better term. But we weren't going to give ourselves the sense that we actually could do it. We're just so shocked that we were back to 2-2 that I think we were just expecting to lose it again. And so we didn't sense anything in the stadium, obviously, because we weren't there. But we just figured, okay, there's going to be another numerous waves of attack, and just God help us.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated that obviously you felt it right there, and that's where you're going to feel it.
I guess it's everything that goes with it was that led to that. This has been an 8-hour exercise during that day of exhilaration, and then just at that moment you just think this has gone again, and this is like 4 years before we went out to Argentina via an own goal in Buenos Aires. Having held a Maradona-led team to 1-1 in Sydney. And before that, it was back to, I think I'm now back to 89. Again, in Sydney, I was there, a full house. We just had to beat Israel. We'd messed it up against New Zealand the week before in New Zealand. And we finally get an equaliser with like a minute to go or something, and then the coaches, all he does is complain about how the ref doesn't have enough time added on. Well, that's not the you're not.
Yes.
So all of this, we blew it against. Well, we didn't blow it. Scotland were a very good team in '85, 4 years before that.
Yes, that is correct.
2-0.
If I'm not mistaken, it was 2-0, 0-0. Yes.
Yeah, we were the better team in Melbourne and just couldn't put our chances away. And you've got to win your home games. And you sort of got to understand that all of that was flooding back on us. That was the emotion. There was a whole lot of history weighing down upon that 2-2. As you know, when you need a goal, 10 minutes is not a very long time.
No. It starts becoming...
When you're stopping it, it's an eternity. When you're trying to prevent one, it's an eternity.
Exactly. It's almost a new Einstein theory that we should carve out just for football purposes, because you're right, that time goes so slowly when you're ahead or it's to your advantage, and it goes so quickly when you need it to go slow. But the 0-0 2-0 with Scotland in '86 reminds me a lot, Shahan, of Iran and Ireland in 2001.
2001, yes.
Yes. It was 0-0 heading into the 91st minute in Tehran. And I was thinking, we probably then deserve to not make it because we couldn't even win at home. And then all of a sudden, Yahya Gol Mohammadi scores a beautiful header off of Matavikia corner. And it's 1-0. And it's just not enough, though. Just what Mark was mentioning with the 89 experience as well with Israel. You finally get that equalizer, but it's just not enough. And I've been there. And that's why I never, and I always remind my son again, and he just doesn't, well, he hasn't experienced, hasn't lived through these things that you're talking about, Mark. You never count anyone out. You never start dancing and prancing before the final whistle. Anything is possible. Anything can happen. When Iran and the USA fell in the same group for the 22 Qatar World Cup, he was joyous because he wanted to experience something similar to what I had experienced in 98. And I said, Aryan, no, never want that to happen again because we had one chance, we beat them, and we can crow all night long until until time immemorial that we won, it's over, we're not going to have to deal with it again, and now we do, and it's not going to end well. I just knew it. And so yes, we've been on both sides of both of us have been on both sides of the equation, and I would far rather be Iran in 97 than Australia in 97, but just as equally, I would have wanted to be Ireland in 2001 and not Iran. So I'm just glad that Australia made up for lost time in many, many ways after that. And I think you're right. With 2006, 3-1 against Japan, I was in a restaurant with my wife and son sitting outside in Germany, and my wife couldn't understand why I was so focused on this match that had nothing to do with Iran and its group. And I said, it's time for Australia to have its moment. I was actually so happy. And Tim Cahill, of course, I think got the third goal, right? Or 2 goals, I think.
He got the first 2, having come on as a sub. Alois got the third. I was at that game as well.
Oh, good for you. Good for you, Mark. But I'm saying, you see things, the ball is round. The ball, things, you're a happy person now again, right? I mean...
But just to let you know that my father was just a mess. I had to fly to a medical conference in Adelaide the very next morning. I couldn't speak for 3 days. And of course, the IVF specialty in Australia is not huge. And we were all nowadays it's corporatised medicine, but in those days it was a cottage industry-based affair, and everybody knew me as that soccer guy,
Of course.
But no amount of consolation would help me for those next sort of 3 days I had to endure away from home. Oh, it's terrible.
But Mark, I'll state something that might help put things in better perspective for all of us. I lost my mother almost exactly a year prior and had not had a single day or night of joy or happiness. And that night was the first time that I saw a glimmer of light ahead. And it wasn't because it was that important to obfuscate my mother's passing, but it reminded me that life goes on.
Yeah.
And sometimes good things can still happen despite having suffered through my worst experience as a human being, just 11 months prior. And it was, by the way, my birthday.
Oh, really?
Oh.
Yes. Happy birthday the other day.
Thank you very much. But again, 24 years later, on my birthday or the day after, both of these were technically the day after because of the time zone difference, we lost to the USA and Qatar. So I've had the best of birthdays. I've had the worst of birthdays from a footballing perspective.
And for us, June and November remain those sort of months where football anniversaries roll along. And now, of course, on social media, it's the second year anniversary of us defeating Denmark. Here's some new footage from on the field. And the other one was we beat England in a friendly in the early noughties. I went to that game as well because that was part of the recovery. We beat England at Upton Park. It was only a friendly. But
is that Wayne Rooney's first ever match for England?
It was. That's correct. He was one of the 11 subs. 3-1 was the final score. Beating England is everything in Australian sport.
Oh, I see. Of course. I know about the Ashes, for example.
Yeah. So that's another argument I get from non-football friends. There's no point supporting a sport where you don't get to play England regularly and beat them, like cricket and...
From the Australian side, who were regarded as the scapegoats for this second half implosion?
the national psyche says Peter Hore, the guy that tore the net down. Other than that, there was no blame. I mean, those of us who knew that tactically we didn't manage the rest of that game very well. But in the end, I don't think it was blame. There was an ongoing sense that FIFA has made it too hard for Oceania. There was never this concept of, as I said, up until the early 80s, we shared qualification pathways with AFC and OFC. But this idea that we'd gone down to, since that system, Scotland, Argentina, look, we didn't even get to the final phase against Colombia. Israel did that in 89. Argentina and now Iran. And there was no prospect that we could see into the future that this was ever going to change. That It didn't matter how good a team we could assemble with all of our tyranny of distance and our standing in Australian sport and society, that we could ever get there, summed up by my brother in the terraces. We're never going to qualify. And that was the feeling that we could just go on endlessly. And what was the point? And this was the time when rugby union were actually the best in the world in the next couple of years after that. And I very much shifted. I never stopped following football, but I enjoyed watching rugby union a lot more because the Wallabies, as the national team's called, did so much better. They were world champions. They even beat New Zealand last time they'd done it. And then rolling on, and look, part of that's Australia's problem because once again, our administrators treated the AFC with such contempt and arrogance and just thought they'd just knock on the door and get let in. We quit Oceania for a while. And on the floor of FIFA with very poor management a few years after that, asked to be sent without any kind of political, I mean, goodness knows, it's so naive to think you can influence FIFA with all of its layers and layers and layers of stuff. And it was 213 votes to 1 or something on the floor of the Congress that we should stay in Oceania. We tried to get that up as a motion with no politics whatsoever. Anyway, and then for 2002, Blatter decides that Oceania is going to get a direct spot until the South Americans pinned him down and said, over our dead bodies. And so that got reneged. I think that was for 2006. Actually, it was in early 2003 that changed. So, and again, 4 years later after the Iran game, we beat Uruguay on a penalty in Melbourne and then had to go to Montevideo. So it was just this sense of this is just going to keep going on endlessly. How are we going to expect to go to Europe? We're lucky to go with a goal. And they're playing in one of the most celebrated, daunting places at the Centenario. How are we ever going to overcome them? So it was the desperation at Oceania, Sean, that was the biggest challenge that we had.
And I imagine there isn't this feeling that, getting close. There's a feeling that no matter what you do,
yes,
there's always going to be a South American or a European team blocking your path.
That's right. And that these events were like Iran was the epitome of it. I don't know if you did this subconsciously or deliberately, but you used the word jinx in a question. There was actually a rumoured curse against the Australian football team that emanated from 1969 in Rhodesia. Do you know that story?
Not entirely.
No,
I don't either.
So look it up, but I'll tell you all about it. So in 1969, we had to play in Africa. I think we're the only nation that's played every single other nation's federation to get to World Cups. We were supposed to beat Rhodesia easily in 1969, I think it was, and 2 draws, and then they had to play a third game, and it was in Mozambique. And the rumour was that Johnny Warren swears it was true. He wrote it in his biography, his autobiography, that they sought the services of a local witch doctor to put a curse on the Rhodesian team, and they buried bones on the field. And Australia won and went to the next phase. They eventually got done by Israel in the final round for Mexico 70. And they refused to pay the witch doctor off the money, owed him $1,000 or something. And the witch doctor turned around and put a curse on the Socceroos. And of course, they did get to 74, of course. But every time this started happening, that we kept losing, Warren particularly kept mentioning it.
I think this story came out in a book, but don't quote me on this, by an American author, I think Franklin Furr, where his book is basically about football and how it's played in all different countries and different cultures and what it means to different societies and everything like that. And he has different anecdotes in this book, and it's very well written. It's from a very much of an American literary perspective, not someone who was a diehard fan, but who finds it fascinating that this is the one activity, human activity that seems to transcend everything else. And I think the story that you just mentioned might be in there as well, because once you explain the
Yeah,
story,
it's in, I looked it up, I refreshed my memory on Wikipedia about Australian sporting curses. I mean, no, sorry, world sporting curses. And it's
oh,
up
I
there
see, I see.
with all of them. So in the end, this guy, a satirist, sort of an aggressive, slightly antisocial satirist called John Safran, created this series of shows on SBS where Warren was still employed, yeah, or worked with, not by that stage, I think, but called John Safran versus God. He used to investigate all these religious beliefs and things. And so Johnny Warren implored him, this is in 2003, after now 28 years of not getting the World Cup, to do something about it. So he does a show where he flies to Rhodesia or to Mozambique, and the witch doctor's now dead, but his offshoots or whatever help him to reverse the curse, which includes getting chicken blood splayed all over him, and then he goes back to Sydney and has to take some special mud that Warren and somebody else has to wipe on themselves. And of course, we qualified 2 years later. It's just a ridiculous. Football is life, isn't it? I mean, it's just one of those.
It is.
It's why I love this sport so much, because of all this sort of
I'm with
nonsense
you,
on the
Mark.
sidelines, let alone the game itself. You know. Yeah.
Absolutely. I feel exactly as you do. I really do.
So,
I share.
yeah, sorry. In summary, Sean, there was a jinx, depending on who you believe. Yeah. But it was more about OFC and FIFA politics. Yeah.
After so many decades, how is Terry Venables' tenure as Australia manager regarded?
Look, as usual in our country, I mean, he was remembered more fondly than not. It was just that was this terrible bad luck game, and because we're not the deepest thinkers about football strategy and tactics and things, because we follow other sports. I mean, cricket's different. Cricket's highly tactical, but things like Australian rules football is, in my view, barely strategic or tactical. But they would argue differently. He was remembered very fondly when he died. That was only a year ago. But it was just part of that long, in the midst of that 32-year run. It was just another thing. Of course, Hiddink is remembered. He's the god. He's like in South Korea. He's forever remembered as the man, never to be replicated for or since, which I think is a little unfair on people like Razic. But there we are.
As far as Iran, they actually changed managers. You have the Croatian Tomislav Ivic, and then finally Jalal Talebi, who was appointed just before the World Cup. I think you kind of touched up on it, but what do you think Valder Vieira was not rewarded for qualifying to the World Cup?
I agree with you, Sean, in the sense that this was something we briefly touched on earlier. I mentioned how the setup wasn't very professional. It wasn't because Vieira himself was not a professional coach. I think he's still to this day, I wouldn't say revered, but very much appreciated. He was a very likable person, and he did his stint. But the Federation realized, okay, now it's serious business. Now we're actually going to World Cup after a 20-year hiatus. We need to have a good showing, and we're not going to get there unless we have a top professional. And that's where Ivic comes in. And Ivic came in and, first of all, brought in some players who'd been discarded before, revamped the team to a great extent, still kept the. We always talk about this, and I know Mark is in agreement because I now know how Mark thinks, and he thinks very, very well. You have a backbone. You have Abedzadeh in goal, who, by the way, was injured in the spring, so we were worried about that. You have Karim Bagheri as a defensive midfielder. You have Ali Daei up front, and you need now to bulk up the center of defense, and that was quickly done by Ivic. He brought back Nader Mohammad Khani, who was a key player, I think, for Team Melli for about 10 years, the Iranian national team nickname Team Melli. Very popular as well, a leader. Jawad Zarinche came back into the fold. Several of the players who had just missed out on the previous qualifiers in the 94 and 90 campaigns came back. But the word was that he was too much of a disciplinarian, too tough on the players. He worked them hard. The trainings were unbearable. But the result was that they became much fitter than I think they'd ever been. And at some point, it appears that in a friendly match that he had set up against Roma, IS Roma, the Italian club, I think we lost 7-0. Maybe it was 7-1. The players kind of undermined him and decided that they would basically allow themselves to be run over to get Ivic the sack, which eventually happened, I think, within 24, 48 hours after that match. He actually had also set up a friendly against Croatia, his home country, which he never got a chance to manage. And when Talibi came in, I think the thinking revolved around the fact that we need someone who understands the Iranian mentality. And so we need to look into bringing in an Iranian coach who has an understanding of world football, who is more of a globalist in that sense than most Iranian coaches who had been insulated over the period of 20 years post-revolutionary Iran. And so Talibi, who'd been living in the States, who was well respected as a player, as a person, always had a good name, and still had ties to Iran. He was actually living in California in the United States at the time, was brought in, and appears to have been a masterstroke looking back. But I was at the World Cup in 1998 and attended the last night. The team was at the hotel in Montpellier after losing to Germany 2-0 that night. And I stayed there until about 4 in the morning and had a chance to mingle with the players, with Jalal Talibi, spoke with a lot of folks there. My sense was that he was not as respected as he should have been by some of the players, that there were kind of different camps within Team Melli at the time. And I think it was clear to see that he wasn't going to last long. He wasn't going to be able to, I don't think he wanted to continue much longer than that because he found himself with a whole new generation of Iranians that held nothing in common with his generation. The backstabbing, the cultural changes that had taken place. I remember at some point in the hotel, I was speaking with Ahmad Abedzadeh, and I said, is Aghay, we would say in Farsi, Agha Jalal, where's Agha Jalal? I'd love to meet him. And he turned around and he yells out from one side of the lobby to the other, Agha Jalal, Agha Jalal, bia inja. Like, what do you mean? This is your manager. This is someone you look up to, you speak respectfully to, at least in front of someone like me. And so I just got some vibes there that Talibi was appointed to bring in an Iranian mentality to help keep the players positive, who understood their idiosyncrasies and their way of thinking and training, but was never going to last because just as I am not able to go back home and interact with people today in my homeland because of the vast changes that have taken place over 2 or 3 generations, he had lived abroad too long as well. But I think he did a good job. He's very much appreciated as the person who really oversaw what was a milestone campaign in the sense that we had not been part of the World Cup for 20 years. But I think if someone like Ivic had stayed on, and if the players had adapted to him and not effectively forced him out. Again, I don't have any documentation that speaks to that, but I've spoken to players. I've spoken to people who were in the camp during Ivic's time and during Talibi's time, and you can feel it. You can sense it. They weren't enjoying their football. They weren't buying into Ivic's disciplinarian style. And so I think looking back, it was a good move. But I don't think Vieira would have been given the same backing as someone like Ivic was, simply because of the personalities involved, the experience, the success that Ivic had, the name recognition, etc. And so I think it's natural that we would have moved on for Vieira, thanked him profusely. To this day, there are so many references to Vieira in such a fond way. But Ivic laid the groundwork for Talibi to reap the rewards, I think. And when I say rewards, it's not that we set the world alight at the World Cup, but we defeated a United States team that thought they were far better than we were, and they weren't. Individually as well as collectively, they weren't. I've always said Iranian football compared to American or the United States version of soccer was light years ahead. The United States started catching up in the 90s, but they thought they were way ahead of where they really were. And we just basically had to wake up again after a 20-year deep sleep. And just like you never forget to how you ride a bicycle, got right back on the bike. And our natural football roots remained intact. To this day, despite all the mismanagement, poor administration, I mean, Mark speaks about Australian football and how it's been mismanaged, and I don't doubt that for a second. But Mark, you've got it far better than we do. To this day, I just can't believe that we still are able to put out a team. But it's all down to individual talent and that hunger that Iranian kids still have to play out on the streets, in the sand lots, in the worst conditions.
In closing, for each respective nation, what is the historical and the cultural legacy of these 1997 World Cup qualifying playoffs?
For Australia, as I said, it was that missed, at international level, that missed chance to step into the Australian mainstream sporting landscape at the time. And combined with the vagaries of the OFC, created a very lean period for Australia over the next few years after that, in a footballing sense. The National League, which was always stumbling along, again, not well managed, ultimately was a bit of a side effect of that. There was an attempt within 12 months, it had already started to be set up to try and have some clubs that were more mainstream community-based rather than the original migrant-based clubs, rightly or wrongly. I mean, one was Perth Glory, which is still to this day a club that persists. The other one was a club that was close to my heart, Northern Spirit FC, which was formed in the North Shore of Sydney, right in rugby union heartland, and did very well for a while. But the fundamentals were not there, and the structure gradually decimated, crowds went down, and in fact the National League folded in 2003, the National Soccer League, and went into hiatus for a year. And this all coincided with basically, interestingly, at a government level, by our Prime Minister at the time, who was a cricket tragic, knew nothing about soccer, couldn't care less about it, ultimately encouraged the one person who could actually change Australian football management for the better, I mean, administratively, and that was billionaire Frank Lowy, Hungarian Jew, creator of a worldwide shopping empire in Westfield, and was one of the original founders of the National Soccer League, and left it because he couldn't bring everybody with him, rightly or wrongly. And he was coached back and was in isolation, like in exile from the game, and was brought back at government level to say, look, in return for funding, can you change the nature of the sport, administrative level? And so out of that was our real watershed year in 2005, where three amazing things happened. We rebooted like a fully professional league, the A-League, which has had its ups and downs, but had some incredible years for 10 years. And I think it's finding its way back again. COVID and a few other mismanagements affected it. We joined the AFC, which is an amazing, how that happened. I mean, the diplomacy involved by Frank Lowy being friends with Bin Imam, who eventually got himself into trouble as well. But how we managed to get ourselves into the AFC was a long-held dream for all of us, because that then meant, this is before we knew about 48 Team World Cups, that meant a better qualification pathway, better international participation at all levels. And in return, we provided a lot of administrative and business know-how to the AFC, worked very hard to make our place, because we were always worried that some of the Gulf nations were going to boot us out at some point. It's still a possibility. And the third thing was beating Uruguay. That was our official exit from Oceania that night, if you think about it. It was the last international game. And it's been all up and hill ever since, which culminated in in, of course, our winning the Asian Cup in 2015, which shows that the nation wants to support. The nation wants to support football.
That is so
They just don't
important.
get off their bums, and it's hard to get rusted on week by week club people. But what we show is that now in the men's and the women's game now as well, the World Cup was spectacular for Australia, and particularly New Zealand as well, but Australia was a revelation. So, the women's game is now, the Matildas is the women's national team is the most popular national team, just after the men's cricket team in the country.
Excellent.
So would any of this happen if we'd have beaten Iran that night? Would we have just bumbled along and in our mediocrity going from World Cup to World Cup? That's the subject of my book, but what might have been my alternate thesis. That's where Australia. So we still look back and think, well, through the noughties over the next 10 years, we did achieve stuff. And maybe it's sort of in a weird way began that night.
Once again, referring back to you, Mark, that's the way I would look at it. Certainly. I mean, I don't have the knowledge of Australian football, whether administratively or on the field of play, but I would always try to look at the positive side of something that was not positive in and of itself, but led to positive things. So that's wonderful that you have that approach and that perspective. And I wish we as Iranians had the same type of attitude and approach towards life in general, because going to Shahan's question, for Iran, I definitely sensed within myself, my friends, people around me here, but most importantly, everything that we were getting in terms of information, visual, audio, correspondence, it was a sense of renewal, of rebirth almost, just like our New Year celebration. The new year is coming in, spring has arrived, everything is fresh. We can believe again. We can look forward to having a better year than the year before. And it was simultaneously parallel with what was happening in the political, social, cultural, economic scene in Iran. Mohammad Khatami had become president. There was this sign that he was going to open up the country basically in terms of cultural freedom, in terms of giving people some political voice. Everybody was looking ahead, optimistic. And a lot of that had to do, believe it or not, with this home and away series with Australia. All of a sudden, people started believing again. And unfortunately, without foundational change, without a change in the mentality of the masses, without a change in the attitude and approach, nothing is going to be permanently positive. And this proved to be a very welcome and happy spark that you almost knew inevitably would be a fire that would be extinguished and then relit again and extinguished and relit again. And it wasn't until Carlos Queiroz came in 2011 and took over as the national team coach that for the first and probably only time since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 that we really started building a national team all the way down to the youth and grassroots level. And yet, as soon as he left, and as he was leaving even, we see all of that hard work being, I don't want to say wasted, but not really being continued. We just don't have the management. We don't have the motivation. We don't have the funding, the corruption in the country, the lack of interest in sport in general, all of the problems that have beset our country manifest in sport as well. And so for us, it was a bright moment, but probably one of the brightest moments in Iranian sporting history.
One, of course, final curious thing is that since that night, Australia and Iran have never played again at the men's national level. We just keep missing each other in the qualification pathways. And
Exactly. And I'll be honest with you, Mark, I miss the rivalry because to me, it's always been a rivalry. There's been no animosity. With Australia, it was always been a real test. And there's a measure of respect, I think, that Iranians have. I certainly do. So I miss that, but in a strange kind of way, when the pairings or the lots are drawn. For example, with this most recent second stage, or is it third stage of the Asian qualifying for 2026, I was very happy to avoid Australia, as I was to avoid
Well,
Japan.
we just think, oh my God, we've got Japan again, who now
Yes.
have our measure, not surprisingly. But there's something about, maybe this is personal perspective, I can't promise that the rest of the Australian footballing public thinks this, but maybe in the last decade, under Querez and the style that Team Melli would play and their completeness as a team and their approach to the game was something I always very much respected and probably feared if we'd have copped you somewhere through the 20 teams in qualification.
The feeling is mutual. So hopefully we can end with this positive note that we both have a healthy dose of respect for one another, both in terms of football, but also in terms of people.
It's been a wonderful discussion to hear the perspectives of each camp for this momentous occasion. I would like to thank both of you for this interview and let everyone know that all our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast listings. So thank you both. Thank you once again.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Sean. And Mark, it's been a true pleasure meeting you. I hope to have a chance to actually see you in person, share a beer or two or three, and
it would be wonderful.
I'd
very much like
it can happen.
Thank you again, Sean. And
thank you.
Your work has been a revelation to me over the last few months, and please continue all the good work.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Sean is wonderful, both as a person, as a podcaster, as a football enthusiast. He has all the goods.
I'm grateful that I get to meet people like you doing this. So thank you once again.
Thank you all. Have a great night or morning, depending on where you are.
Yes, too. All the best, everybody, and thanks again. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.